Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. This is a pivotal time for our nation and for our city. Each week, from now until November 4th, we'll address the issues and concerns of New Yorkers and how the nominees for president and vice president are addressing them and each other. We'll try to assess this extraordinary period with news and government observers and with the newsmakers themselves. Today, we'll approach the upcoming election by looking back on our nation's history. Naomi Wolf created a sensation in 2007 with her provocative book, The End of America. Well, she's not done yet, and neither are we. Her latest book, Give Me Liberty, a handbook for American Revolutionaries, answers some of that controversy. It's just been published by Simon & Schuster. I'm delighted you're able to be with us today.
Thank you, Sheryl. I'm very happy to be here.
In your new book, you call on Americans to reclaim their role as revolutionaries and basically to revolt against the current government. Why? And explain what you mean.
Well, I don't call on them to revolt violently against the current government. I call on them to do what the founders called on all of us to do. It's in the Declaration of Independence. We started as a nation that was founded on the idea that being a real patriot means confronting your government when it is derailing American ideals or oppressing the people or subverting our republic. And that's what it says in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It's a personal contract we're all asked to commit to rise up against tyranny and injustice. So I'm definitely making the case, which I made in The End of America as well, that, and many people are making it, I'm not alone, that there's been a dangerous subversion of our checks and balances, a subversion of the rule of law. And it would be dangerous in the hands of any leader, Republican or Democrat. I've been saying, it's not good for the country if Barack Obama has these powers to surveil the opposition or to, intimidate journalists or to arrest journalists and so on. I don't want to live in that kind of America, and the founders didn't intend for us to live in that kind of America. So I'm definitely calling on citizens across the political spectrum to rise up and use these 55 action steps to be an army for freedom and for the rule of law and for the Constitution, restore checks and balances and repeal these monstrous laws.
I can rattle off a long list of things that I and my friends are really unhappy about with what's going on, the Iraq War, a really aggressive American foreign policy that has really led to the loss of American prestige all around the world. The sad state of the economy, the lack of health coverage for so many Americans, and the high cost for those who have it, our support of torture and imprisonment without trial, warrantless wiretapping of citizens. How did we allow this to happen? And did we just, abdicate our responsibilities as Americans?
Yes, the answer is yes, Sheryl. You're absolutely right. And it's late in the game for us to be asking, how did we allow this to happen? We messed up. We were complacent. We were internet shopping while we were letting our government disappear people off the streets of Macedonia and Italy. And we were, willing to not think critically about what it means to let the leader of our nation have endless powers to read our emails or listen in on our phone conversations. We handed over our agency to our elected officials who can't represent us the way they need to because they are in thrall to special interests who are making a lot of money by turning America into a police state. I mean, the weapons manufacturers have shifted at the end of the Cold War into surveillance and security technologies. So Barack Obama can't stand up to AT&T. John McCain can't stand up to AT&T until citizens have an army pushing back. Our elected officials can't stand up to these forces or won't stand up to these forces that have hijacked the Constitution. But having been so hard on us, and I have to say the foreign policy issue is definitely karmic, how can I put this? I don't want to say karmic payback, but we are waking up to the fact that since 1898, we've been okay with corporate interests sending our military to subvert democratically elected governments around the world and to, set up puppet dictators who arrest journalists, who disappear people, who torture people, who create paramilitaries. We've been, turning a blind eye to it for over 100 years as long as we had freedoms here at home.
Right.
And so now some of why we're in this terrible mess, this dangerous mess, is that we haven't learned to recognize the signs of encroaching freedom because we haven't been paying attention to how we're encroaching on people's freedom around the rest of the world. So some of this is self-inflicted, but some of it, I have to say now, moving to other agents, is that we've been, in good faith, we thought, or a strong minority of us thought we were electing a leader, George Bush, in the democratic tradition and democratic system, who had two people behind him at least, Cheney and David Addington, who systematically set out to use the law to subvert the law, just like democratically elected groups, minority groups in Germany in the early 30s used the law to subvert the law.
Right.
So these are very sophisticated agents, and they had a very un-American agenda. And since so much of what they did is in secret, you can't really blame the American people for some of the extraordinary damage that's been done.
But can you say at this point that Americans are just unaware or ignorant about the extent to which American ideals have been subverted, or is it that they feel that powerless to do anything about it?
Yeah, I think with such a diverse and huge country, we can't really generalize effectively about Americans. Some Americans, obviously, the ones who are listening to Sarah Palin, whip people up with demagoguery in a very un-American way and use terms like terrorist and traitor and un-American, let me go back over that because I just contradicted myself. Certainly people who are supporting these abuses, people who don't have a problem with torture, people who are about to, trying to elect McCain and Sarah Palin, who are going to simply clamp down further on police state tactics, according to their own stated positions. John McCain shamefully caved on the Defense Authorization Act of 2007. Even though he was a tortured war prisoner, he allowed horrific loopholes to be put into that permit things like sexual humiliation, sexual abuse, religious humiliation, forced nakedness, appalling things. But other people across the country are waking up. I'm speaking to audiences of like 500, 800, 1,200 people across the political spectrum. And certainly it's transpartisan. You've got the whole Ron Paul community who are still out there fighting to restore the Constitution. Millions of Americans, and you've got people on the left as well fighting to restore the Constitution. But I do think people do feel powerless, and that's why I wrote Give Me Liberty, because I was very struck last fall when I was talking about the end of America to audiences that people saw the same abuses I did. I wasn't surprising them. I was putting a picture together that made sense to them. But they felt absolutely disempowered. They felt like their voices didn't matter, emails and phone calls to Congress didn't matter, their protests didn't matter, and they were kind of depressed, clinically depressed in terms of their action, in the sense that they felt like there was no cause-effect relationship anymore. So that's really why I wrote Give Me Liberty, because I studied movements of people that pushed back against tyranny and restored freedom.
Right.
And first, you need a mindset, which is not depressed. First, you need that founders kind of, and by founders, I don't mean the well-known propertied white men we're all familiar with. I mean the whole founding generation who are often left out of the history books. Working people, farmers, enslaved African Americans, washerwomen, all these citizens who were swept up by this vision of liberty.
And basically said, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take this anymore, and did something about it.
Exactly right.
At the same time, like, for instance, I get almost daily emails from organizations like MoveOn.org and the National Action Center, and despite the recent little dust-up, Acorn has signed up, apparently hundreds of thousands of new voters. And in New York, just this last weekend, there was a march demanding that government do more to help ordinary people who've been affected by the national financial
really?
crisis.
I haven't seen that march covered at all. Where's it been covered?
That's well, I got the emails about it.
Where's the mainstream media on citizen protest?
But there is a fair amount of activism and protests going on.
It's not effective enough. I really learned what works and doesn't work. Let's look at protest. I discovered in my research, one thing you see when citizens are able to break up a tyrannical regime is that what you always see is, there are like 10 steps to freedom, too. We need to know this map. You always see thousands and thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of people in mass protests Where are they? In the street. Meaning they stop traffic, they bring things to a halt. Business as usual cannot proceed. You saw this in the Baltic states when the Soviet Union was falling. You saw it with people power in the Philippines. You saw it in the civil rights movement. So that kind of protest is illegal in the United States now. There's been, I discovered, 30 years of stealth over permiticization of American protest, meaning the protests of the 60s and 70s were so effective that the vested interest, the powers that be, thought, well, we can't have citizens having this kind of power. So there's been across the country an effort that's been successful to guarantee that in order to have a legal protest, you stay on the sidewalk, off the street, you can go from here to there. And here in New York, it's shocking.
You're
it's
just
shameful.
penned in. You're penned in.
Oh, you're penned like animals.
Right.
One of the things I did in this book is I took myself on a journey of trying to use my rights, and I was blocked at every step. Here in New York, the site of so many of the important protests and marches and speeches in history, I tried to stage a rally for the Constitution, Union Square. 15 minutes in, I was told what I was doing was illegal because it's illegal to use a bullhorn in Union Square. And I've got this horrible scene of protesters trying to protest the Olympics because it's a police state.
Right.
And I interviewed New York City police officers who were like, oh yeah, we don't want them to have any speech at all. We're limiting them to 4 hours, 2 groups, behind like bars. This one gets the bullhorn for half an hour. This group gets it for an hour and a half. Then this one gets it for another 2 hours. And then I got this lieutenant saying, but of course our ideal is 0. Here in New York City,
right.
Which is supposed to be like the freest, loudest city on earth.
Is it also impossible to have a huge march in Washington anymore?
What I'm trying to say is you can have huge marches in America,
right.
but they're by definition impotent.
Okay.
Martin Luther King said...
Because they can't disrupt things?
Exactly. And I'm not talking about violence.
Right.
I'm talking about the will of the people to assemble, which is enshrined in the First Amendment. People need to assemble and petition their government for redress of grievances. So Martin Luther King said in a letter from Birmingham jail, he was talking about why he was protesting without a permit, and he said sometimes the tension has to be manifest. Sometimes things that are below the surface have to come out. And what I mean by that is, how did Pakistan restore democracy? Millions of lawyers and judges, but also ordinary citizens, went into the street, and Musharraf just couldn't function. Right? How did they bring down the Soviet Union? Millions of citizens went into the street, and the tanks couldn't get through. They stopped the tanks. So right now in America, you can go from here to there on the mall, but you can't bring anything to a halt.
Yeah.
So you can't. It's like by definition impotent, and now we've got Homeland Security pumping millions of dollars into police departments across the country, training police officers and seating agents who are not identified in among these police officers, so that you have a militarized response to citizen protest, legal First Amendment protected protest, like in St. Paul, where you've got footage in the new movie they've released about the end of America. You can see it free on endofamericathemovie.com. You've got footage of people beating protesters with 4-foot truncheons like they have in North Korea, but also microwave technology to disable violently protesters, tasers, which have killed 300 people, so violent that Canada is investigating suspending their use, rubber bullets, which are so dangerous that the United Kingdom doesn't use them anymore because so many Irish citizens have died. And now you've got the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division of the U.S. Army deployed as of October 1st somewhere in the United States of America, armed. And the president's private army, essentially. So do we have our First Amendment rights? Technically, but has a dangerous boundary been crossed where protest is now physically threatening if you're the protester? Absolutely. Would I take my daughter to a march? If I'm an angry voter who finds that I've been purged from the voter rolls on election day, am I going to speak up if the 1st Brigade is standing by? I doubt it very much.
Very interesting. We have to take a short break, and we'll be back after the following messages.
Gotta get that. Oh, I must be careful there. Well, that's a nice picture.
Come on, Anna.
Okay.
Foreclosure doesn't affect just you, it affects your whole family too. If you've fallen behind on your mortgage, we can help. Call 1-888-995-HOPE because nothing is worse than doing nothing.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking with Naomi Wolf, the author of Liberty, a Handbook for American Revolutionaries. It's just been published by Simon & Schuster. So how do we win back our right to protest?
Yeah, and many other rights that are under assault. Well, we have to be very strategic. What we have to do is drive a city-by-city and state-by-state effort, first to demilitarize police departments so that it's not dangerous for us to protest. You can reach out to the National Lawyers Guild to find out exactly how to do it in your own community, because police responses are not federal, they're state by state. One of the things I call for in Give Me Liberty is a better education for citizens to understand what laws you need to change at a city level, state level, and what laws you can only change at a federal level. Which, again, I used to think of as incredibly boring, but now I have this very emotional attachment to all of these processes because I feel part of it now.
Right.
And citizens I'm talking to do feel like, wow, when I can make a difference, these things really come alive. You have to lobby your city councils to refuse Homeland Security money. Homeland Security money is kind of bribing departments to militarize themselves, and also shockingly at St. Paul, Homeland Security money was kind of a kiddie to pay off lawsuits that citizens would eventually bring for the brutality that they were planning. It's extraordinary. So you have to, it's toxic, you have to not touch it. What else we do? Well, I teach people how to dress safely for protests, and we have to lobby our elected officials. And in Give Me Liberty, I teach citizens how to become very forceful. I call them democracy commando teams, to lobby their representatives much more effectively than we now know how to do, to become counterweights to the special interests. We need to form ourselves into those teams and then lobby our representatives to ban tasers, ban rubber bullets, ban microwave technology used against citizens, and then roll back the over-permitization process. But there are many other laws we have to pass. For instance, the American Freedom Campaign, an organization I co-founded, and I'm now traveling the country trying to sign people up for this kind of mass army of citizens to restore the Constitution. We've got a 10-point legislative agenda. Everything from restore habeas corpus to protect journalists, you and me, from prosecution under the Espionage Act, to no more warrantless wiretapping, no more torture. And it's been introduced into Congress by Kucinich and Ron Paul. And it's stalled. So we've got to get 10 million, 20 million Americans to lobby their own representatives to pass
and this
this
bill
legislation.
covers all of those points?
Exactly. It would really heal a lot of the monstrous crimes that have been committed.
How about Barack Obama's election campaign, which has energized hundreds of thousands of young people as well as older Americans, raised hundreds of millions of dollars? Is that, in a sense, a huge outpouring? I mean, is that huge outpouring of support for Obama, in a sense, a huge political protest against what's going on?
I'd like to think so, although, again, I think it's not enough. I think it's, first, as I said earlier, I think it's naive for us to think any president we elect now with these laws in place is going to be able to be free of these constraints on liberty without our help. But I'd like to see citizens as understanding that, mobilizing to vote for a president is great and it's important, and voting is fantastic and important. And in fact, I'd like to see it mandatory, as it is in other countries like Australia. But it's not enough. Part of this 30-year propagandizing of the citizenry has been directed at encouraging us to accept a more and more limited idea of what our citizen agency is and what our role is as citizen leaders. The founders intended for citizens to lead the debates and not pundits. They intended for citizens to stand up for the Constitution, not just constitutional scholars. And they intended for citizens to to lead the nation. Principle 4 of these 7 principles is ordinary people are supposed to run things. So after reading this book, or after getting this message, however you get it, I would want citizens to think, okay, I mobilized my friends, I registered people to vote, I voted, that's just the beginning. because we have to stop handing our power over to Barack Obama or John McCain to be the knight on the white horse to lead us out of this mess. People have to understand that, we are the source of power. I mean, this was the brilliance of the civil rights movement, which is so much my model. Here were people who were told, you're poor, you don't have resources, you don't have necessarily higher education, you don't have a voice, you don't have mainstream media behind you. But Dr. King and other leaders said, you are powerful, you have dignity, you have the ability to transform this nation, you have the responsibility to transform this nation. And when people believe that, they become more than the sum of their parts.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have talked about how much we need young people, the role that young people play in, they're often the revolutionaries. They certainly were, when I was growing up in the civil rights movement and the women's movement and certain other movements. Are they stepping up to the task, young people?
I've met many wonderful people who want to. And this is, again, part of why I wrote this book, because a lot of young people on the left felt very disempowered, because there's been, unfortunately, and I criticize this in the book, a left-wing kind of a yielding of the idea of patriotism, and a left-wing refusal to own how radical and transformative American ideals are. I mean, the left looked in the 60s at, Mao and Che, and didn't look at our own, founding generation as, this extraordinary heritage for transformational change. And also now in college campuses on the left, a lot of young people have received such a thorough analysis of what's wrong with our system, but no examples of how to change it, or no examples of movements like the civil rights movement, or the anti-child labor movement, or the progressive era, where citizens, or how women got the vote, where citizens made such a difference in a civil society. Mm-hmm. So they're very depressed. So one reason I wrote this book is so that they would kind of snap out of their depression and understand the power ordinary individuals can have in a functioning democracy. But I'm also meeting many young people who are very energized and are ready to go, but don't have the skill sets, and I hope to give them the skill sets in this book.
Among the things you call for Americans to do is legislation to make national referendums possible.
Correct.
Which I assume would require an amendment to the Constitution.
That's correct.
And how would it work if we got it?
Well, that would take a lot of deliberation on the part of citizens, and a lot of citizens who've heard this idea are calling for a constitutional convention to discuss it, which I think is great. I mean, that's what citizens should be doing, not leaving it in the hands of these people on Capitol Hill. Why am I in favor of a national referendum, and how would it work? It sounds very kind of an abrupt transition, but it's not really. First, our framers gave us the option of amending the Constitution. And second, a lot of Western Europe has a referendum system, and they have vigorous democracies, more vigorous than ours in some ways right now. 24 states have a referendum system here in the U.S., and Abraham Lincoln had called for a national referendum, wanted one to address the issue of slavery. So it's not unheard of even in the United States. The way it would work, the details obviously need to be worked out. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but the effect is, probably the way it works in Switzerland, which is, in Switzerland, I summarize the process in the book, citizens deliberate canton by canton. So in America, they'd be deliberating, region by region, state by state, on an issue set forward by a percentage of citizens who basically start a petition. And then it's on the ballot if it passes a certain level of citizen support. And then, there's a vote that's national. And if a certain percentage of American citizens vote yes on that referendum for that issue, like capping emissions, it's such a great example of one that Congress will never pass in our lifetimes in time because of special interests stranglehold on the process, especially the oil industry. But a vast majority of citizens, transpartisan, want to cap emissions so that our kids can have a planet. So that's an example of something that, overnight with a referendum on capping emissions, citizens can say, well, this is, a law that we've passed. It's basically citizens passing a law. And that's how it works in Switzerland. That's how it works in Western Europe. I would think it should be limited because, again, you don't want, we were never meant to become a majoritarian democracy. We were meant always to be representative constitutional republic. But I do think it's necessary because right now that alone would break the stranglehold that special interests have over Congress and give people power again, which they do not have.
We've only got about a minute left, but do you see any signs that we're moving towards doing these things as you travel around the country and try to stir things up?
Yeah, I'm seeing this fantastic groundswell of support for these ideas and people really taking the ball and running with it, which is what they should. I mean, he's not the leader to look at, or him, or me, or you. The leaders are the people in their communities who think, okay, this is my mandate. So yeah, I was just in Salt Lake City yesterday. You wouldn't have thought it's like a hotbed of support for, a Jewish New Yorker who is saying, time to revolt. But there were 500 people there, cross party lines, and they have started a group themselves using this as a handbook, and they're organizing people and having monthly meetings and taking action. It's very exciting, and I'm hearing from communities across the country who are doing it, and what we're doing at the My America Project, which you can go to at myamericaproject.org, is putting all these groups in touch with one another and creating action steps. For instance, a petition for this legislation to really turn this into a force, an army for the Constitution. So yes is the answer.
I'm sorry we're out of time. My thanks to Naomi Wolf for joining me. Give Me Liberty, a handbook for American Revolutionaries, has just been published by Simon & Schuster. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.